So welcome to the this talk by Michael Aird. His research on nuclear risk is being sponsored by Rethink Priorities, and they have also sponsored a forecasting tournament on Metaculus. The basic layout for today is Michael has prepared 20 to 30 minutes to explain his research, and during that time, participants are invited to ask questions by raising their hand. If you have a question that you'd like answered after the presentation, you can type it in the chat. And if this goes a little long because people want to interact a lot during the presentation, that's great. Otherwise, we'll have a Q&A at the end. So with that, here's Michael.
Great, thanks, Tom. I'll just get screen sharing going and then launch into it. So you should all be able to see my screen now, right? Cool. And present. Great. So as Tom said, this presentation will be on nuclear risk research, forecasting, and impact, and the various intersections between these things. Inspired by the fact the prompt is that I'm doing this Metaculus nuclear risk forecasting tournament, but this also touches on a bunch of other issues that I think should be of interest to people here and is at least interesting to me. So that's a start. So an outline of this talk. So you know what you're in for. I will first sketch 4 common clusters of views on nuclear weapons. These are sort of, I think, basically most people who've thought a bunch about nukes, and especially who work on nukes in the sort of Western world, at least, can be pigeonholed fairly well into one of these views. Often there's variations or there's something somewhat in between, but this sort of seems accurate to me. It's not really based on any sort of other work, and it's my own terminology and stuff, but it seems pretty accurate to me. The 4th one is my own view, so it's of course the best, but we'll first go through the other ones and see the various things that they get right, but also that they might get wrong. And then I'll discuss the goals of my research, which sort of follows on from that last thing, from the inadequacies in many of the common views and the uncertainties. Discuss some research projects and takeaways that I'm working on, discuss how the Metaculus tournament fits in with this overall project of my work and this path to impact that I'm trying to sketch out of how to ultimately make the world better. Discuss how forecasting could be used more often and better in research and decision-making generally. So not just with nuclear risk, not just with my work, via this tournament and also some other things, I've started percolating some ideas about this broader thing. I think in theory, this could be scaled up massively, this kind of work, and could make the world much better, but it's also pretty ambitious. And then we'll have a Q&A, of course. Disclaimer here, this is just my preliminary personal thoughts. I've been working on nuclear risk since about November last year, so fair bit of time, but part-time, less than a year. It's a very big, complicated topic, and I've got several months ahead of me still, so I haven't yet really formulated my bottom lines and pulled everything together. So a lot of what I'll say here is either like tentative or vague or obvious, one of those usually. And ask if you don't know something or some jargon or whatever. Also feel free, as Tom said, to like type chats in the question anytime or raise your hand. I'll pause occasionally, probably, and also have the Q&A at the end. So first, these clusters of views I mentioned. So I'm going to sort of do my impression of these people. So I'm going to put it all in quote marks, and I'm going to say some things that I don't fully believe, though I do also think they get many things right. The first one we could call perhaps the alarmed advocates. So this view would start with the idea that in 1941, most people had no idea that nuclear weapons would ever exist. Then just 4 years later, in 1945, the US, of course, used 2 nuclear weapons against cities. This was Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Global stockpile then reached 70,000, rocketing from 0 to 70,000 in a matter of mere decades. We had 9 states now that possess nuclear weapons, and more might soon. There's been this proliferation, this growing number of states that are involved in this complex tapestry. Relations between these states are complex, interlinked, and worsening. So this person might highlight resurgent Russia, rising China, India, Pakistan tensions, the possibility of Iran developing weapons, tensions in the Middle East with Israel with nuclear weapons. The risk of nuclear terrorism is growing. Nuclear war could start at any time and is inevitable eventually. If we go long enough with nuclear weapons in possession and we don't reach global zero, which means complete disarmament everywhere in the world, eventually at some point there'll be some accident, miscalculation, strange leader making a bad decision, and we'll eventually have this conflict. Nuclear war would, if it happened, be large scale. It would likely cause nuclear winter, billions of deaths, and the collapse of civilization. So therefore, in light of all this, we need to raise awareness, change policies, ratify treaties, and ultimately ban the bomb. And there is indeed a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons that has passed. It is now in force, though no nuclear armed states have signed it. So that's one perspective. And this perspective has a lot of ingredients to it, a lot of pieces. But if I try to put it in an image, in just one image, it would probably highlight this portion of a graph from Our World in Data, where we go from 0 weapons in 1945 up to this 70,000 I mentioned, just this terrifying ascent up a mountain to doom. And also would highlight this section on the right, which shows this 9 nuclear states, including some that have very tense relations between them, rather than the 0 we had in the 1 and then the 2, we now have 9. Then we have a very different perspective. So again, that was all my impression. I don't fully believe those claims. Another perspective that we could call this sort of unconcerned skeptics. There have been 0 offensive nuclear weapons since 1945, would be where the emphasis on this starts. We've had about 70 plus years without any conflicts. So the base rates seem, in a way, pretty promising. And this was through the Cold War, through many tensions. Global stockpiles have shrunk to 20% of their peak. Yes, they did reach 70,000, but they have since declined precipitously down to about 13,000. People routinely overestimate proliferation, force sizes, and odds of conflict. I'll probably find a way to share the slides later. There's some links there to some evidence of people overestimating these things. This sort of like doomsayers, sky is falling. Often it doesn't fall, at least not yet. Relations have been bad or worse before we had the Cold War. We didn't have any nuclear conflict. Now that was obviously very, very tense at times, but we still got through it. So it's not clear that tensions are just rising and it's just getting worse and worse. Nuclear war and nuclear terrorism are unlikely and would be small scale, would be the sort of angle of this perspective. Nuclear terrorism, probably just one nuclear weapon, really. Nuclear war could still just be one. There might be no retaliation. Or if there is, it might still be like single digits or low tens of nuclear warheads used, not the sort of thousands used picture that we often imagine. Counterforce might be more likely than counter-value. So here the jargon begins. Counterforce is when you have targeting just of military targets like silos or air bases. Counter-value would be when you're aiming specifically to like harm civilians. And then whether industrial counts as counterforce or counter-value, like factories, that's often like a bit ambiguous. But broadly speaking, counter-value is much more concerning, both directly, because if you target a massive city, there's many more deaths. And also from nuclear winter perspective. Nuclear winter requires many fires, many smoke, like lots of smoke. So if you're only targeting things like silos, then you could be fine. This does get complicated for a bunch of reasons like capitals and the fact that air bases are near cities often. But broadly speaking, counterforce is less concerning. Counterforce might be more likely. If so, then we should be less concerned. This perspective would go on to say nuclear winter, billions of deaths, and the collapse of civilization all seem unlikely, even given nuclear conflict. So we should focus on other problems. There's a lot of other things to deal with in the world. This thing doesn't seem that likely to happen. If it did happen, it might not actually be that bad. It'd be bad, but there's a lot of things going on in the world. So we shouldn't focus too much on low probability and low stakes scenarios. And many policies or treaties would undermine deterrence and or just won't happen. So, for example, the Treaty on Non-Proliferation, the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Yes, it's passed, but no one who actually has nuclear weapons has signed it. And maybe they just never will. It seems extremely unlikely that we'll actually hit global zero, complete disarmament. There's a bunch of other stuff that seems unlikely as well, even major arms reductions. And some of the things, if they did happen, could be bad. If everyone reduced their arms by half, then that might be an unstable situation where one power could do a first strike and take out the other side, which might make nuclear conflict more likely. So this perspective might highlight a different portion of the exact same graph, this very pleasing descent down this mountain of doom from about 70,000 to about 13,000. This graph doesn't, the numbers are different by different estimates and stuff like that, but it's broadly showing that same picture. Then we have a third cluster of views, which I would call the competitive realists in a sort of international relations sense. So this might start with deterrence has protected us from nuclear wars, conventional wars, and proliferation. The fact that people have nuclear weapons means that you don't want to attack them because then they might nuke you. And it does seem that we definitely haven't had nuclear conflict for over 70 years. It appears that we have had less conventional war than usual. And one leading explanation among many academics is that this was partly because of nuclear deterrence. And we've also had less proliferation than many expected. And this could also be because of deterrence. States don't want to build nuclear weapons if you can nuke them when they start doing so. The next point that this perspective might raise, once slides progresses and reminds me what I believe within this impression, is we face this multipolar, multi-domain security environment. So we're not just US-Russia anymore. We have a rising China, we have a resurgent Russia, we face a range of regional and unconventional challenges, such as Iran, such as various terrorist actors. We have technological developments that could undermine deterrence. It could make nuclear war worse if it happened. We have various like cyber threats, things like that. Given all of this, we need to protect the interests of liberal democracies by preserving extended deterrence and alliances. Extended deterrence meaning not just if you nuke me, I'll nuke you, but if you nuke my friends, I'll nuke you. And if we don't have that, that might increase the chance that your friends get invaded or that your friends build nuclear weapons in order to not get invaded. So a lot of people worry, for example, that if the US does arms reductions that a lot of advocates think would be good, that might make Japan or Taiwan or South Korea more concerned, and that might lead to proliferation there because they worry that they won't be protected by the US's nuclear umbrella anymore. So there's many things that seem well-intentioned that might actually increase nuclear risk, according to this sort of perspective, and also according to me. I do agree on that. So we need bilateral incremental dialogue and shifts. The US and Russia need to talk, the US and China need to talk, and they need to gradually control or reduce arms tit for tat. We do not need unilateral concessions like the US just halving its arsenal by itself, and we do not need multilateral idealism like the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This perspective, again, to put it in an image, it might highlight this section of this picture. Russia, North Korea, and China, their number of nukes, and the fact it's rising. So then finally we get to my perspective, which I'd call an uncertain prioritizer. So on all the above issues, my stance is basically, I really don't know. I'm very confused. It's all very complicated and very big. More specifically, I think the following points each seem unlikely, but not extremely unlikely over the coming decades. And also, it's really nice to know how likely they are. Major proliferation. Many more states could develop nuclear weapons. Unlikely, but not extremely so. Major force size increases and also yield increases. So yield is the explosive yield of the bombs. More yield means more civilians can die immediately, and also more smoke can be produced by the explosion. Technological developments that increase the odds of conflict and or increase harm. For example, there could be ways of better detecting submarines. And if you can better detect someone's submarines and their mobile launchers, then you can more easily, it's more likely you can do a first strike that takes out most of their forces, which might increase the chance you do a first strike. If you have two sides, both worried that the other one is going to do a first strike, it makes it much more likely that they do preemptive. It could increase the chance of war. It seems kind of unlikely, but not extremely unlikely that we would have that sort of development. And there's a whole bunch of other technological developments that could occur to do with autonomous weapons or various things. Nuclear conflict itself seems somewhat, but not extremely unlikely. Given nuclear conflict, many detonations, including many counter-value, seems somewhat, but not extremely unlikely. I expect it would be a small exchange. In reality, if it happened, I don't expect thousands, but thousands seems plausible. I don't expect counter-value or like a lot of counter-value, but it does seem plausible. The targeting of cities just for civilian damage. And given that, it seems unlikely, but not extremely unlikely, you would have nuclear winter, billions dead, and or long-term future harms. I say and or because nuclear winter, I think, is the main way you could have a harm to long-term future, a sort of existential catastrophe, the extinction, or permanent worse future. But I don't think nuclear winter is the only way. There could be other scenarios, which we could return to in the Q&A if you wish. So it sure would be nice to get more precise on all of that. Somewhat, but not extremely unlikely sounds something like somewhere between 1 in 10,000 and 1 in 2, which is a very, very big range. And where it is within that massive range matters a lot for a lot of decisions. And it is hard to get more answers on that range, which will lead to the forecasting and the research I'm doing. Meanwhile, so that's all about how big the risk is. Meanwhile, there's many ideas for reducing the risk, for actually changing it, not just prioritizing. But which would have high upside and low downside. A lot of them could backfire, either for nuclear risk or for other issues. Like it might reduce nuclear risk, but also increase the chance of other conflict or harm the sort of strategic position of liberal democracies relative to other countries, which seems bad for some reasons. And also some of them just might not do much, so might have low upside. Which ones are tractable? A lot of them just seem pretty pie in the sky or like very hard to do. Like it would be great if it happened. If we had like zero nuclear weapons forever and effectively enforced and monitored and verified, that does massively reduce nuclear risk, obviously, basically to zero. But it just seems like that's never going to happen unless we're just playing a different game because of transformative artificial intelligence or something like that. In anything like the current world, we just aren't going to get that, I think. So it's not really worth pushing for, in my opinion. How to pursue these things. So there's some goals that I think are good, high upside, low downside, seem tractable, still unclear how best to actually get them to happen. Do you focus on like raising awareness? Do you focus on treaties, policies? what sort of things. And then how to prioritize this versus other important areas. So I care a lot about nuclear risk, but I also care a lot about other things. And it's not clear that we should just have like loads of people lurch towards this cause. We should also have people focusing on some other things like biorisk or AI governance, things like that. So given all of that litany of uncertainties and confusions and like disagreements and stuff, my research steps in, and there's basically two goals at a high level when you really zoom out. One, get better answers to the following questions. To what extent should nuclear risk reduction be prioritized? And what should be prioritized within the broad area of nuclear risk reduction? And this is especially from a long-termist perspective. So I mentioned earlier this idea of like existential catastrophes and harms to the long-term future. I'm not going into detail on that because I assume you guys are broadly familiar for the most part. But yeah, I'm not just thinking of how to reduce the chance of some nuclear conflict. I'm also not just thinking of how to reduce the expected number of deaths in the near term. Both of those things seem good. Like to reduce them is good, obviously. But I'm especially concerned with the very, very high stakes scenarios, even if they're relatively unlikely, where many warheads are used, perhaps even more than existed in the Cold War. There's no intrinsic reason why we couldn't have an arms buildup bigger than the peak we've reached, and then all of them being used. Seems extremely unlikely, but maybe that's where a lot of the risk comes from if you're thinking about things like extinction. So I really, really want to reduce massive arms increases, for example. That's one place where my view would differ from some other people in this space, though we also agree on many things. Then I want to disseminate those better answers to decision makers. I especially thinking of EA funders, funders in the effective altruism community, such as Open Philanthropy, but also various others. These are people who I think could act in big ways on my work and are more like a good blend of having a lot of resources and being decently likely to pay attention to me. Then there's other people who are slightly less good on the combo of those two things, but also still good. EAs in the policy world, EA researchers, EAs deciding on careers, and non-EAs, which could be funders, policy people, etc. Non-EAs obviously have almost all of the resources in the world, but are just less likely to pay attention to me. I use sort of methodologies that they might find sort of odd, or like the sort of long-termist perspective I'm coming from is just like less distinctively appealing to them. But I do try to communicate with a lot of them, and I would likely disseminate my findings to them and hope something comes of it. This is all sort of part of what I'm doing here is setting context for where does the tournament come in. And how I'll disseminate this will include articles, docs, which can be a bit more candid and tailored, so it's just shared with individual people, meetings, again, more candid and tailored, talks, possibly some other things. And then some projects I'm working on, I'll just basically list the titles to give context and so that we can return to in the Q&A if people want to discuss specific topics based on the titles. One is 9 mistakes to avoid when thinking about nuclear risk. Oh, also, this is all drafts, but I'll share the slides afterwards and you can like click the links to go through the drafts. There's also some of them linked from the tournament. This is just on sort of misconceptions and things like that. Database of estimates of nuclear risk. I could show you a bit of this later in the Q&A if you wish. This is where a lot of the tournament outputs will be used, just trying to compile a bunch of data estimates and extrapolate and aggregate and form a sort of bottom line view on when you pull this all together, what are the chance of conflict seem to be, what does the existential risk seem to be, how many weapons are likely to be used, etc. How much funding and labor goes to nuclear risk reduction? Obviously, the more neglected it is, the more likely it is there'll be low-hanging fruit available that we can pluck. So getting a sense of how neglected it is seems useful. Again, the tournament will come in handy here. Already there's a couple of questions up that relate to this. There'll be more in future rounds that try to get at the sense of like how much funding is going here, how much labor is going here, and therefore how much can an individual help. There'll be a post on China-US, China-Russia, and China-India nuclear conflicts, which someone else, not me, is working on, but I'm mentoring them. They happen to be in this call. They're a decent fraction of the audience, so maybe they'll have something to say on that later. How many nuclear warheads would be used and against what target types given nuclear conflict? If you people are participating in the tournament, you may have noticed my obsession with these questions. This seems really crucial if you're thinking about the long-term harms. So I've got a lot of questions and we'll have even more questions on things like, would there be counter-value targeting? Would cities be targeted? How many warheads will there be? In particular, will there be a massive rise? I think a massive rise is unlikely, but maybe a lot of harm comes there, etc. So yeah, the forecast will be peppered into that post to quite a large extent. Nuclear risk research ideas, just kind of like a less focused research agenda, just a bunch of topics that seem important, prioritized. The tournament can also be helpful here because I can get us, I'll circle back to that soon. Shallow review of ways to reduce risk from nuclear weapons, trying to compile a big batch of possible ideas. and get some initial thoughts on, well, taxonomize them, organize them, get some initial thoughts on what are their upsides, what are their downsides, how best to pursue them, do they seem tractable? The tournament can also be quite helpful here. I haven't had many questions like that yet, but I will hopefully have more. They seem a bit harder to formulate. Recommendations about nuclear risk reduction for EA funders, self-explanatory. The Metaculus tournament itself, and there's also some other things. That's odd. Okay, I'll see. Maybe no, I think I'll do the Q&A all in one go. So I'll just keep charging on with my monologue for the moment. But so how this tournament fits in, some overarching points. Also some links for like further thoughts if people want to follow up later, if they want to have any even more monologue from me, but in written form. So one thing that comes to mind is consilience, which is also called convergence of evidence. When I'm thinking about this tournament, I'm not thinking this tournament is my research. These are like the truth. It turns out that it is this likely, and that's it. It's more like, I think these are just really hard questions to answer, the questions I'm trying to answer. And there's not really an established methodology that just like does it, like that nails it. So therefore I want to use a lot of each flawed, like a lot of methodologies that are each flawed, but hopefully fairly uncorrelated, and see what they converge on, see where they disagree. And then that seems as we're uncertain and more research is needed, see where they do agree. And if there's a bunch of things that I would feel pretty uncertain about individually, but they're all pointing in the same direction and they're pretty uncorrelated, I can be pretty confident. So this is especially important because it's very hard to formulate exactly the question I want you like as a forecasting question, and also to incentivize it. Often they're like, given that there's 1,000 nuclear detonations in 2040, what would happen? And that's not like a normal forecasting question. It's pretty hard to like pay you more if you do well on that. So therefore, like I need a lot of lines of evidence, and this is one of them. It's important, but it also has to be complemented with other things. Another overarching point is forecast versus comments versus fortified essays. I find the forecast quite useful. I also find comments quite useful. And for some questions, I think I would actually be, I would get more value from like one person explaining the base rate, like how they found a base rate, what sources they used and how they adjusted, than from like the aggregated forecast from like 50 people. So I would be keen for like more comments. One of the questions I might ask you, if there's time for me to ask you questions at the end, is like, how can I get you guys to give me more comments? But yeah, the forecasts themselves are also obviously useful. Fortified essays will be coming up. So we could talk about that later if you want, but they will also presumably be quite useful for similar reasons to comments, because forecasters, yeah, they generally do a good job, are pretty like epistemically sound and come at things from a pretty different angle from other people. So it's handy to like have their reasoning actually spelled out, not just like give me a number and I'm like, why? It's nice to know why. Okay, then some specific goals of this tournament. So it's like overarching points about how, yeah, here's like some specific ways that the tournament's useful for me. One way I could break it down. And also I think this is how forecasting in general can be useful for researchers and stuff. So first thing is this input into what research questions I investigate, in what depth and from what angle. There's way more to look into on the topic of nuclear risk than I had time to look into. There would be like, if I worked on it for 5 years, I wouldn't get to all the questions that seem interesting. And I'm not going to work on it for 5 years because there's so many other problems in the world that I also want to give some attention to. Therefore, this can help me prioritize which questions to bother looking into. So one example is, does hemp warrant my attention? So this is the idea of like nuclear electromagnetic pulses, or high altitude electromagnetic pulses. This was raised as something that might be a big deal by some people. And I was sort of like, I'm kind of skeptical, but I don't really know. And I don't really have time to look into it a lot. So I put up a forecasting question. I'll also put up some more later. And if they basically all say this is pretty unlikely and is unlikely to be a big deal if it happens, then I'll just basically drop it. If they say it's pretty likely, then I'll maybe spend a week looking into it properly. And if that still makes it seem a big deal, then I'll spend longer. Then we also have, so that's like when I'm on the fence about whether to spend time on it. We also have inputs into my conclusions, framings, and emphases. Do I mention non-great power conflict escalating to include great powers? And if so, how? Again, some people are concerned about this idea that like if you had a North Korea exchange or you had an India-Pakistan, somehow someone like US, China, or Russia would also get involved, or both, two of them. So I put up a question about that. This will be, again, an incremental update towards either mentioning it or not bothering to, because I don't know how concerned to be yet. So hopefully this can help inform me on how concerned to be about that sort of scenario. Direct inclusion of my write-ups. A lot of my write-ups will just directly feature forecasts from this tournament. this will especially happen in the database, but also explanation of my reasoning. I'll often be like, this paper said this expert said this, the forecasting question said this, and it will show the various lines that either agreed or disagreed, and reasons to be either uncertain or more sort of certain you might think about a certain conclusion. Summaries of the tournament results will be an output in itself. I'll probably just do one, but maybe multiple, saying the sort of key takeaways from this. The tournament is an output in itself. People don't have to read what I've written. They can just now go to Metaculus and check questions and see what they say. I expect many of the busy decision makers won't do that, just because it's like hard to sift through it all and work out what is this actually, what's the bottom line of this? What's the takeaway given these numbers on this very precisely formulated questions? And also just people aren't used to it, but they can do it. And probably some people will, hopefully, just check the questions themselves and form their own beliefs. There's some sort of community building thing, like in theory, it might get forecasters to think more about nuclear risk and existential risk. Might get nuclear risk people to think more about forecasting. The latter thing I think would be particularly exciting. If non-EA nuclear funders were regularly thinking about forecasting, partly because of my tournament, that would be great. I think it's unlikely, but would be cool if it happened. And I might try to push that a bit. It's also just an experiment. We're seeing how this sort of tournament goes. And it's a big batch of questions that can be repeated, remixed, or used in other ways after the tournament. So now that I've written all these questions, or with help from people, I can run them again after 2024. So once they all resolve, or the early ones all resolve, we can run them again with like another 2-year horizon or whatever, with way less effort, and just continue to get a sense of like, okay, how likely is it now that the US and China are going to go to war? And just keep tabs on that. We can also remix them, change the countries, change the thresholds, move from 100 to 1,000 weapons, change the types of weapons and specifications with less effort than building questions from scratch, or use them in other ways. So something we might try to experiment with is just paying individual Metaculus top forecasters, either people who've done well in this tournament or people who've done well previously, or paying like good judgment super forecasters to forecast on some of the questions, not trying to reward them for doing well, but trying to just like basically commission them as contractors based on their previous track record to both forecast and explain their reasoning. Now the questions are written, that can be done more easily. So that can be, again, a complement to the tournament, a different sort of angle on the questions, when you're incentivizing people a different way, seeing what results at that point. Okay, and then, yeah, I'll super briefly cover this, and then I think the Q&A is next. Some like high-level vague thoughts on how forecasting could be used more and better that I can expand on during the Q&A if people wish. It would be useful to streamline the process of doing roughly what I'm doing. This took more time than expected. I'm like very excited about the tournament, but it turns out it's like pretty hard to like write a crap load of forecasting questions and like have them be good and then put them all on a platform and then get people to care and then write up all the results and all that. So various things that make that faster would be great, especially if people aren't yet convinced that forecasting is great. So that you can make it an easy ask. You can make it like, this will be convenient for you. Improve questions and forecasts. There's probably a bunch of ways that my questions could be better. There's probably a bunch of ways to like better train people, better solicit forecasts, better incentivize. Get more people to experiment with roughly what I'm doing. A lot of people just haven't tried it, and it would be great to get them to try it. Get better at making forecasting genuinely and legibly useful to people. So obviously the above 3 points would help make forecasting more useful to people. It would make the results more accurate and make it easier to get the results. Also legibly useful, like trying to package things and explain to people, like especially, for example, policymakers or people outside of the effective altruism community, why should they actually care that like Metaculus says 60% on this question? I think they should care, but we've got to explain to them why they should care, and we've got to like highlight the takeaways. Get people to use forecasts, inputs, and decisions. So that's not just making it genuinely legibly useful, getting them to actually get into the habit. We can do that later or separately. So cool, yeah, so we'll do Q&A now. I'll just highlight some things that I think could be interesting to discuss, but you can ask me whatever you want. So anything about the research projects I listed earlier, I gave you a bunch of titles. I can give you my tentative takeaways as of today on those topics, or why I looked into them, or whatever. The importance and potential limitations of forecasting on long-range or catastrophe-related questions. So a lot of the questions of the tournament and the ones I'm most interested in are like, what's going to happen by 2050 in some extreme high-stakes situation? That's an unusual forecasting question, so we can talk a bit about that. How forecasting could be used more and more effectively, more frequently and effectively in research and decision-making. So that includes things like whether and how to extrapolate from and aggregate such forecasts. This would be very useful for my database thing. I'm currently pretty unsure. I've done a lot of extrapolations and aggregations. I've thrown a lot of numbers around and tried to get bottom lines, but it's hard to know how best to do that. How to organize, package, and highlight takeaways from forecasts for decision makers. You can't, you don't want to just send them like, here's a list of 40 things, like try to sift through it all and form a belief. You want to figure out how to package it for them. And I don't know how best to do that, so it could be interesting to discuss, but I have some thoughts. Or anything else you're interested in. So I will pause there. And I guess I'll let Tom decide how to run this section.
Yeah, well, first, thank you so much, Michael. That was an amazing presentation. I've been talking to you quite a bit the last few weeks, but this really helped bring a lot of things together for me. So thank you. Thank you for putting that together. Everyone is encouraged to write questions in the chat. I don't know if it's possible to raise your hand. You can also do it that way and ask verbally. For some reason, I'm not seeing that option on my screen, but you might have that on your screen. But maybe to kick things off, I'll start with a first question for Michael. I'm curious, I guess it's a two-part question. One, is there anything that you feel like you've learned that was surprising from either round one or round two from the tournament? And maybe kind of related to that are there any questions where you strongly disagree with the Metaculus crowd in their forecasts?
Yeah, I think it's a good pair of questions. Yeah, so as I said at the beginning, there's basically 2 months of like vigorously doing this research left for me, maybe 3. Which means I haven't yet worked out my bottom line views on lots of things. So I'm like, I think a lot of stuff's updated my beliefs, but I can't remember, I haven't like figured out exactly how it should. But some things that like pop to mind. One is, one function of this is sort of trying to call bullshit on 10 things and then like seeing which 3 you guys don't say bullshit on, and then like the other 7 you do. So hemp was an example where I think currently it's looking to me like this tournament's going to update me. We only had one question so far, but we'll have more later. I think this tournament's going to update me towards thinking I just don't need to care about hemp. And that was sort of what I expected, but it was like good to check. I mean, like I still care, but like there's so many, it's like low on the priority list. But then there's other things that maybe aren't cropping up as, oh, this isn't a big deal. And it turns out, you guys are saying like 20%, 40%, that's high enough that this is a risk. So one thing is this counter value type thing. I tried to put a bunch of questions on counter value, and the tournament was basically saying a very low proportion of detonations would be counter value. And people pointed out it was specified a weird way, the question. So I put up a different specification, and that one says like way higher numbers. So I was initially maybe like, oh, maybe I can update towards being much less concerned than I thought. And now I'm like, maybe I should be more concerned than I thought. So I'm mostly confused. So I'm going to try a new specification for this round or a future round, and just keep trying to like work out that. Something that I don't exactly disagree with either forecast, but I disagree with the combo. People seem to be saying that there's probably going to be very few nukes if there is a conflict. And also they might be saying that there's not going to be many on cities. Not sure about that bit. But then they're also saying about 15 teragrams of smoke would be produced. And that doesn't seem to fit together because if you expect like a pretty low number of nukes, yeah. But on a lot of them also, so on a lot of them people seem to be saying probably it's not a big deal, but there's like a 2% chance of thousands of something happening, like 2% chance that there'll be like many thousands of warheads or many thousands used. And so I guess something I'd be interested maybe to talk about would be like, are people aware that their forecasts are like saying there's a 2% chance of that, or is it just like the distribution they make happens to imply that and they haven't checked?
Nope, that's great. That's a question that I would also love to hear the forecasters weigh in on. It did appear like there were a few inconsistencies, but I now see 2 questions in the chat. I'll just read them real time. How did you personally become interested in this cause area? It seems difficult for me to select one and stick to it, given that there might be something better to work on. Did you feel this way? How long will you be working on nuclear safety?
Yeah, so when I joined Rethink, the like very mundane answer is just like Rethink had a half-finished project on nuclear risk. and it seemed like I was a good fit for finishing it relative to the like, and then the other hire was a good fit for working on forecasting. So like I just did that. But there's also like a deeper answer or something, because I could have chosen not to. I could have been like, this is too low priority. So overall, basically, I think that nuclear risk should be a substantially lower priority than biorisk and AI, and a few other things like building the effective altruism community and global priorities research. But it should still be sort of on our shortlist, and it should still be given non-trivial attention. And I also think it's currently like super neglected in the sense of number of people doing cause prioritization research on it. So there's ORFED, which does like intervention type research, but there's very few people looking into how big a deal is this and what should we do about it. I think it's basically just me, and I'm doing it part-time, and I'll finish relatively soon. So there's a real gap there. So like I think there's a neglectedness argument for at least we need like a couple people on this. Yeah, and then how I think about cause prioritization, I think like, yeah, I mean, I think it comes back to the consilience type thing or convergence of evidence. I think these are really tough judgment calls, and I try to gather a lot of scraps of info and ideas and reasoning, which can include forecasts, can include research outputs, can include what smart people say, even if I don't know exactly why they're saying it, can include trying to figure out why smart people say it and like build my own inside view model of the world. And then also personal fit plays a really big role. So in this case, yeah, it was because I was a good fit to do this project, so I did it. Which sort of outweighed the fact that in general, I think more people should be on bio or AI, for example. Yeah, and in terms of how long I'll be working on it, basically, I will probably finish working on it vigorously at the end of the year, and then there'll be various things, like planning fallacy means probably I won't actually have finished. So like various things I'll need to wrap up during like the first month or two of next year, but I'll sort of be wrapping up there. But that's not really because I've decided the topic isn't a big deal, it's just because Rethink Priorities, where I work, got this like really exciting opportunity to do a big AI governance thing. So I'm moving it. It's not just that I'm like pushed away from nuclear, I'm like pulled towards something else that's cool.
Oh, great answer. We have one more question. Have you developed any models for the different belief categories, perhaps creating a weighted average of them?
So is this about those like 3 clusters of views I mentioned at the beginning?
That is my understanding, yeah.
So I guess the short answer is like no, but the slightly longer answer is like, I think I've viewed it more like I think they're like too mistaken, or so the first 2 just get things wrong, and the third one isn't long-termist. So like the very alarmed one, the very unconcerned one, just like get things wrong. So I don't, it's not like I'm very uncertain about something and I'm like, oh, this expert might be right or wrong. I just like know that they're wrong on certain things or whatever. Like they're just very overconfident on certain points. So I don't want to like exactly give a weight to that overall perspective when I just know certain things are wrong. Instead, I want to take the good bits and like put it in my own model. And then my own model does have things like, there's like one perspective on which large scale detonations and counter value are likely, and there's a perspective where they're not. And then I do like a weighted average of those 2. But I don't sort of adopt wholesale the concerned person, the unconcerned person, and then the national security type person, or the sort of like competitive realist, I called them. All those terms, by the way, were all just like for this talk. They're probably not very good terms, but the competitive realist, they just aren't a long-termist. They're just focused on like how to make sure the US goes well or whatever, which is probably correlated with the long-term future going on well, but not like super correlated. So it's not like they might be right or wrong on the question I'm asking. They're just asking a different question. So I've talked to a lot of experts from each of these camps, and every conversation has benefited me. But I more sort of try to take the good bits and like be critical thinking about it. Yeah.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. So given that I see at least a handful of forecasters in the audience, and we're trying to make this a 2-way conversation, maybe I will flip the microphone now and let Michael ask the audience any questions that might be on his mind. Oh.
Yeah, there we go. Yes, I was just reminding myself what my questions were. So one thing I thought would be interesting is, well, so a few that, where should I start? One thing is like, your forecasts, I imagine, so if for the people in particular who are forecasting in the tournament, I imagine your forecasts are probably often based on interesting reasoning and readings and stuff like that. So firstly, is that true? And secondly, if so, can I get you to, how can I get you to share that with me? Because there's relatively few comments. There are some comments and I usually find them pretty useful, but there's not that many. And I imagine you guys are all thinking interesting things. And like not every comment's going to update me massively, but like if I had 10 of them and then probably 2 or 3 would like substantially change my views on things, which could be great. So yeah, to what extent are you often like actually collecting base rates, finding interesting readings, finding little data points and things like that versus just sort of making a guess? And how can I get you to tell me things, either in comments or like messaging me directly if you don't want to share with the other people and let them steal your points.
And actually, I'll just invite, since it's a relatively small group, I'll invite anyone who wants to either write their response in the chat or feel free to unmute your microphone and give a spoken answer if you'd like. Just while people gather their thoughts, I'll just respond to that a little bit from Metaculus's point of view. We're really hoping that the fortified essay is a way to both get at the longer term questions that really interest you and also hopefully serve as a platform for people to offer some of their reasoning and commentary. So I'm hoping that at least a handful of the forecasters in the audience will participate in that when we get that off the ground in the coming months.
Yeah, I wanted to comment. I think the sort of notebooks or the essays are pretty interesting, and one on nuclear risk could pretty decently synthesize these questions. I don't actually know if you've written one of the notebooks on that yet, but I think that would be an interesting idea. And in terms of my personal forecasts, there's not too many questions that I've predicted on, especially I haven't predicted on many of the ones in the new batch. But questions like, I have it open now, like North Korea possesses material for 100 warheads. I might create sort of like a simple model for that, or just sort of go off of the data you posted or the ranges you posted. It doesn't seem as if it'll increase too much by 2024, because that's a little over 2 years. That's not that much. I also tried to take sort of, you mentioned it in the slides, but sort of like impact bias, overestimating the sort of like impact of future changes or overestimating the probabilities of things occurring in terms of like nuclear risk or extraordinarily rare events. So usually I think I'm a bit overconfident in my predictions, so I'll usually decrease them a bit. And for most of them, I haven't sort of tried to calculate a base rate, but I think I probably should augment my forecasts with that. And I'll post more comments. Also, thanks for your talk.
Cool. Yeah, that all sounds good. I guess a related question is like, so one thing we wondered when we were setting up the tournament is to what extent the fact there's prizes disincentivizes comments, because then people might, like it's somewhat zero sum or something. So in theory, if you make a good comment, then everyone like updates and then they get more points, so you get less money. Like it seems quite plausible that wouldn't be a big thing, because also people just want to be useful and help these decisions go well. But yeah, I'm wondering to what extent you guys feel you guys feel disincentivized from commenting by the fact there's money here relative to normal Metaculus questions that don't have any money attached. Obviously, I mean, this isn't a very good survey. It's just like asking people, but yeah, still interesting.
Yeah, great question. If people want to respond in the chat, I would be fascinated in hearing the answers. And maybe just to slightly build on that, whether if there was a team structure, whether people think that would change the dynamic and make it easier to comment. So meaning if you were on a team in a competition, you could comment to your teammates, but no one else outside your team would be able to see it.
Well, I'll just answer my perspective on that. The sort of tournament money doesn't really affect my forecasts too much. I think I'm more interested in like improving my forecasting and ability and judgment. And I think that what disincentivizes me from sort of forecasting as much on questions of the long term is that the likelihood of them resolving ambiguously, they're interesting to see and forecast on, but it's sort of like when there's questions that I'll resolve ambiguous more often, say like by 2040, if this happens, I'm sort of less inclined to forecast on many of those questions. But I don't think that has to do with commenting. For me personally, the like money at stake does not affect my inclination to comment or not to comment. And also for teams, I almost feel that having teams would disincentivize commenting, because it's almost much more apparent that there's sort of an out group with the other teams, and you don't want your comment sort of helping them. But yeah, that's my take on it. But I think I'll be going. But again, nice talk. Thanks for hosting this, Tom.
Yeah, you're welcome. And thank you for that comment. So that's actually fascinating. Just pointing out how teams could actually lead to less comments. So that's an important thing for us to think about.
Yeah, I think one thing we discussed on teams was like, or comments in general. One way to deal with that, I think, would be to have teams, and then the teams are encouraged to comment to each other. And then I get to see it all, and no one else does. Which is then like it's then like an odd structure, but still, like if we're thinking a decent part of the impact flows through like improving my beliefs, and then I tell people things, then it could work maybe. But yeah, I think there could be a lot of interesting experimental like little tweaks done to various tournament structures and stuff that could be cool over the next year.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're definitely discussing those internally, so we'd love to hear. Well, I think we have a lot of Michael's ideas. We'd love to hear other people's ideas as well. And actually, Michael, there was a question about sharing the slides. I know you said that you would share them. Have we figured out how they will be shared? Is that you emailing them, or maybe I would be emailing everyone on the Eventbrite?
I've shared them just now in the chat. I think I'll change the access settings. You won't have access right now. And I'll also share them with you afterwards, because that's probably better in some ways. Let me just, okay, so now.
Perfect. And actually I can think of a really, I can make sure to post them on the Metaculus website under the nuclear risk tournament as well.
Another like question I have, if it was still on like me asking people questions phase, is just in general, does anyone have thoughts on how I or Metaculus could make the rest of this tournament or future tournaments better? So similar to what like we just were discussing there, but more broadly.
Great question. Give people a few seconds to think that through. Maybe no one's going to jump in on this one. Again, I'll just reiterate. It looks like we've lost a few people. There's only 5 minutes left. I'll just re-invite anyone in the audience who has a question for Michael to feel free to unmute yourself or write any question in the chat. And if no one does have any questions, I might ask my last question, which I think you touched on, Michael. But I'll ask it again. And that's really, can you take another stab at saying what is the question that you think is most important, or that you'd like answered, that kind of doesn't really fit? We haven't figured out how to fit into a forecastable, resolvable question.
I think there's a few different angles on this. So one would be like, I think there's like different types of questions that are especially hard to make into a forecasting question. One is, I think like Tetlock calls it the rigor relevance trade-off. So like on the relevance, low rigor side of that. So that would be like, just if I could get forecasters just tell me like the actual truth on how much should people prioritize nuclear risk, that'd be great. But that's not a forecasting question. And also, like, likewise, if I could get them to tell me like what should people do within nuclear risk and how should they do it, that would be great. But that's just more like someone actually writing up a strategic plan and like inputting loads of evidence into that. So yeah, one thing is just like the actual high level questions. The highest level questions are very hard to get forecast on, or just can't. Another thing is like causal questions. So I really love it to like be like a different angle on that is, what would the world be like if open philanthropy gives $5 million to nuclear risk? What would the world be like if they don't? It'd be great to know that, but this has issues like presumably open phil makes good decisions, and so therefore if everyone's conditioning on open phil having decided to give lots of money, they're also conditioning on nuclear risk is a big deal and open phil made a good decision there, or probably. So it's not like if I made a pair of questions conditioning on this, conditioning on not this, it doesn't get at the causal thing, which I know me and Tom have talked a fair bit about. And then also just like things that are long-term and conditional can be made into forecasting questions, but then it's just like an uncertainty about how much effort do people put in, because it's harder to incentivize them. And also, as was mentioned earlier, like there's less feedback, so it's probably less interesting and fun to a forecaster to some extent. Yeah, so those might be like the 4 big categories of things, like high level, causal, long-term, conditional. Each of those seem to make it hard, or like particularly conditional on unlikely things. Yeah.
Yep, great answer. And there's still a lot of active thinking on how to solve this causal problem. I'm still hopeful, but I think it requires a little bit more clear thinking.
I think we can get it on some things. We'll probably have in a later round some, like, it's still evidence. Like the thing that's conditioning on open phil, not like conditioning on open phil, not giving money, that would still be some evidence. It's just like kind of like somewhat crappy evidence, but it's better than nothing. So we'll still have some of them, but yeah, I'll just have to take everything with a grain of salt.
Yep, absolutely. Well, with that, we are basically at the hour. So I'll take this opportunity to thank Michael for his amazing presentation. Thank Rethink Priorities for their support of Michael and their sponsoring the tournament on Metaculus, including fronting all the prize money. So thank you, Rethink Priorities. And thank you all the participants for your forecasts in the tournament and your taking part in today. If you have any questions, feel free to email Michael or me after this call, or ping us questions on the Metaculus site. That works as well. So with that, thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.